Good evening and welcome to the special meeting of the Board of Education for February 4th, 2019. There are a couple of things that will happen at this meeting. We will be administering the oath of office to the re-elected board members, and then we will have election of officers when that is concluded. If you want to follow along with our agenda, there's one outside the door. Otherwise, if you're watching at home, you can follow along at livoniapublicschools.org, highlight over the board tab, and you can drop down to agendas and you can follow along. Mrs. Bonifield, would you go ahead and take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bradford.
Here.
Sorry. Mrs. Burton.
Here.
Mr. Centers.
Here.
Mrs. Frank.
Here.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Here.
Mrs. Bonifield is present. President Johnson.
Here, we have a quorum. Thank you. So item 2 is administering the oath of office. Mrs. Oquist, how are we going to proceed with that? Are we just going to have Mrs. Shield?
We are. Mrs. Shield is
Very
going
good.
to come. Mrs. Shield is going to join us at the podium and call up our 3 newly re-elected board members.
Thank you very much, and we'll start out with Mark Johnson. Mark, if you'd like to join me at the podium. Raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Mark Johnson,
I, Mark Johnson,
do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support the Constitution of the United States
that I will support the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of this state,
and the Constitution of this state,
and that I will faithfully discharge the duties
and I will faithfully discharge the duties
of the office of member of the Board of Education
of office of member of the Board of Education
of the Livonia Public Schools School District,
of the Livonia Public Schools School District,
Wayne County, Michigan,
Wayne County, Michigan,
according to the best of my ability, so help me God.
to the best of my ability, so help me God.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And next we have Colleen Burton. Colleen, if you could raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Colleen Burton,
I, Colleen Burton,
do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support the Constitution of the United States
that I will support the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of this state,
and the Constitution of this state,
and that I will faithfully discharge the duties
and that I will faithfully discharge the duties
of the office of member of the Board of Education
of the office of member of the Board of Education
of the Livonia Public Schools School District,
of the Livonia Public Schools School District,
Wayne County, Michigan,
Wayne County, Michigan,
according to the best of my ability, so help me God.
according to the best of my ability, so help me God.
Congratulations. And next we have Liz Jarvis. Liz, if you'd like to join. If you would raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Liz Jarvis,
I, Liz Jarvis,
do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support the Constitution of the United States
that I will support the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of this state,
and the Constitution of this state,
and that I will faithfully discharge the duties
and that I will faithfully discharge the duties
of the office of member of the Board of Education
of the office of member of the Board of Education
of the Livonia Public Schools School District,
of the Livonia Public Schools School District,
Wayne County, Michigan,
Wayne County, Michigan,
according to the best of my ability.
according to the best of my ability.
Congratulations, Liz.
Thank you.
I'd like to just take a moment and thank Linda Shield, who is our city treasurer, who is here with us this evening. She has served our community in many capacities, but also very, very ably at this table for many years as our board president, as a member of the Board of Education. So we were so pleased to welcome you here this evening to bring forward our newly elected members of the board.
Well, thank you so much. It was my distinct honor to be here, and I wish you all the best in the coming year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Do we have any questions or comments from the board?
Yay.
Yay.
Welcome back. Thank you.
Mrs. Burton.
I'd like to thank some of the folks who are in our audience this evening who have been some of the biggest supporters of our Board of Education for a long, long time. It's kind of a drizzly, crummy evening out there, so thank you for coming out to celebrate with us. Thank you also, as it's been said, to Linda Shield. Linda was special to me personally, was the one who encouraged me initially to run for the board. I'm really glad that you did, Linda. But also a lot of hard work on this Board of Education over 10 to 12 years ago was done on Linda's shoulders and those who are serving with her. And I'd like to give her our sincere thanks for her service.
I couldn't have said it better. Thank you, Linda, for all you've done, not only for the Board of Education, but for the city as well.
Absolutely.
Okay, any other questions, comments? Mrs. Frank?
Congratulations to the three of you on serving another 4-year term. I'm honored to serve with you, and I'm so thrilled to have you back. Congratulations.
Thank you, Crystal. And we don't do this by ourselves. We all have families, we have spouses, and Dave is here tonight, and I know he supports everything that Colleen does, and it's not easy. We spend an awful lot of time in this job. A lot of people don't see that. It's behind the scenes work that we do. For instance, a week ago, Saturday, we all spent the entire day over at Schoolcraft College at a seminar, a full day, and you don't see that. And our families, they suffer for that as well. And I just want to thank my wife if she's watching, Blake if he's watching. Thank you, Blake. And Dave, of course, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Okay, then we will move on to item 3, audience communications. I do not have any blue slips. If anyone wants to address the board, I don't see a huge rush to the podium, so we'll move on to item 4, which is the election of our officers. This is the time of year when we do have to do a little bit of housekeeping, and election of officers is one of them. And the way this will work is we will accept nominations for, do we have to do treasurer as well?
Yes.
We do have to do treasurer at
It's
the
an
end.
appointment.
Last one.
Right, okay. For all of the board offices, so at this time, I'm going to open the floor for nominations at this time for president. Do I hear nominations? Mrs. Burton?
I would like to nominate Mark Johnson as president. One of the significant roles of the president is to be a spokesperson for our Board of Education. Mark has got experience doing that, and Mark, you've done a very, very capable job of it. It's easy to do it through normal, calm times. It's much more challenging to do it when the road gets a little bit rocky, and that does happen usually unpredictably, but it does happen. Mark, you've done a superb job being our spokesperson for our Board of Education and keeping our group going forward in the right direction, and I'd like to see you continuing to serve.
Thank you, Colleen. Any other nominations for president? And seeing none, and I accept that nomination. And we have to vote. It's an open vote. So, Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll?
Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
we'll start with you. Mrs. Bradford,
Yes.
Mr. Centers,
Yes.
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes. Thank you for the nomination and for the vote of confidence amongst this board member and my colleagues. I appreciate that very much. We'll move on now to nominations for vice president. Are there nominations for vice president? Mrs. Frank?
I would like to nominate Colleen Burton for vice president. She was a president last year and did a fantastic job, and for continuity and just for leadership on the board, I'd like to nominate her.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Any other nominations for vice president? Seeing none, you accept?
I do.
Very good. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford,
Yes.
Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis,
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes. Motion carries, and congratulations on being elected Vice President, Mrs. Burton.
Thank you very much.
Thank
I appreciate the support.
We will now move on to nominations for Secretary. Are there nominations for Secretary? Mrs. Bradford.
I'd like to nominate Tammy Bonifield for secretary. She was our current secretary, and she does a fine job at that, and so I would like her to stay in that position.
Thank you, Mrs. Bradford. Any other nominations for Secretary? Seeing none, Mrs. Bonifield, you're willing to accept that?
I will. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Bonifield. And would you take the roll, please?
I most certainly will. Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Benefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes. That motion carries. Congratulations, Mrs. Bonifield,
Thank
on
you
another
very
year. All right, now we have to, we just
Appointment.
do the appointment.
And I'll accept on her behalf.
All right, and
There's a motion.
we've got the motion. Okay. Could I have a motion to appoint treasurer, please?
President,
Go ahead.
Mrs. Burton.
move that Allison Smith be appointed treasurer of the Livonia Public Schools School District for 2019.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mr. Centers, to appoint Mrs. Smith as our treasurer for the school district for 2019. Are there any comments?
I accept the motion on behalf of Mrs. Smith.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist. Any other comments?
Especially being at the seminar that we were at on school law and finance this past Saturday, it shines a light again on what a phenomenal job Allison Smith does as treasurer of ours, as technically the treasurer of the Board of Education, but the director of finance for our school district. I have the utmost confidence in her, and it's wonderful to be able to have someone who knows our books inside and out so well and can answer questions for us all. I think she does a superb job. We're very blessed to have her.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Any other questions or comments? Just another observation at the seminar, she could have taught that.
Yes,
Yeah.
she could,
I
absolutely.
mean, there was no question. To have her there and to be able to answer our questions was unbelievable. So she is certainly a tremendous asset to this district. And thank you, Mrs. Oquist, on accepting that for her.
Certainly.
All right, we have come to the end of the agenda. Oh, we do need to vote on that. Yes, okay, Mrs. Bonifield.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Benefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes, motion carries, and congratulations. Mrs. Smith, I think it's a congratulations, I'm not
Thank you.
quite sure.
Yes.
We will pass that
A
along.
thank you is more like it. All right, we've come to the end of the agenda on the special meeting. Is there any other business to be brought before the special meeting?
No.
Seeing none, we are adjourned, and we will be back in just a few minutes for our regular meeting. Thank you. Good evening and welcome back for those who tuned in for our special meeting. This is the regular meeting of the Board of Education for February 4th, 2019. We're going to start it off with a roll call. Mrs. Bonifield.
Sorry, take the time, sorry, 7:06. Okay. Mrs. Bradford.
Here.
Mrs. Burton.
Here.
Mr. Centers.
Here.
Mrs. Frank.
Here.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Here.
Mrs. Bonifield is present. President Johnson.
Here, we have a quorum. Thank you, Mrs. Bonifield. And we're going to impose upon you one more time. Would you help us and lead us in the pledge, please?
Gladly. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you again, and welcome to those who are in attendance tonight. If you want to follow along with our agenda, you can find one out on the table to the right of the door. If you are watching at home and want to follow along, you can go to our website, livoniapublicschools.org, highlight over the board tab, and you will see the agenda, and if you drop down, you'll be able to follow along with us. Just a note on the agenda, we are going to take a short break after item 3C to mingle with our guests tonight, and then we'll jump back into it. This is our voting meeting, and the items that are coming before the board tonight have been addressed on at least 2, perhaps even 3 prior occasions at our study session and the committee of the whole, where we really have a deeper discussion into the items. So you won't hear that deep discussion tonight. It'll be a little more superficial, and if you really want to follow along and listen to the items that we're going to vote on at any particular regular meeting, I invite you to tune in to our Committee of the Whole meetings. They're also on the website. You can go to them and watch them, and you'll hear a little more in-depth discussion of the items. The other thing that I've become accustomed to doing since I've been the president is I talk about our district climate goal, and it's one of the very important goals that we have within the school district. And it says that all students will experience a positive, safe, and welcoming environment where both students and adults respect and value one another. We on the board believe that is extremely important, particularly in these difficult times that we have. And this means between student to student, adult to adult, and adult to student. We on the board follow that. We respect one another. We don't always agree with each other's position, but we respect the position, and we do it with respect. And that's what we ask of anyone who comes before the board. And what a better way to set an example for our students to do it here in a meeting. So that is one of the things that you'll see tonight is a lot of respect. So we'll move on now to item 3, which is communications, and 3A is School Board Recognition Month. Mrs. Jenkins, how are you tonight?
Very well, thank you. Good evening, President Johnson, and congratulations on your re-election and
Thank you.
appointment as president. Members of the board, Superintendent Ellis. Normally, this will sound strange. Take yourselves back to January for this first item, since we did have a snow day last week when we were still in January. January is School Board Recognition Month. So with the new year brings a new opportunity to say thank you to our board members as we join more than 600 school districts across the state to recognize School Board Recognition Month. As members of the Board of Education, you are among the more than 4,000 elected community volunteers statewide who serve on local school boards and who give freely of your time and talents to benefit students, staff, and the community. Our district is very fortunate to have a group of board members who take the public trust and responsibility of this role very seriously. Members of this board dedicate an enormous number of hours preparing for and participating in board meetings where they're faced with decisions that are often challenging and some that are often quite difficult. In an era of unprecedented choice in education and funding constraints that never seem to end, school boards are tasked with charting a course that provides long-term sustainable success for current and future students. Board members here in LPS are charged with the oversight of a roughly $150 million budget that provides for approximately 2,000 employees and more than 14,000 students in 24 schools. It's a huge responsibility and one that each of you takes quite seriously. We can see your dedication, your enthusiasm, your thoroughness, and we also see your heart. Your work here is a labor of love, and that is evident. We can see your pride as you visit our schools and cheer on our teams and applaud for our students' accomplishments. We see your dedication when you're serving up pizza at Bounce Back to School events and tasting chili at the chili cook-offs and whatnot, or taking a front row seat at student performances. It's that Livonia pride that makes our school district shine, and we're thankful for our Board of Education and that you're such a large source of pride for our district. You have earned the distinct title as Honorary Board issued by the Michigan Association of School Boards. For the benefit of the public, this means that each member of the board is certified by the MASB after many, many hours of MASB coursework. We are so proud of each one of you for this accomplishment and for your dedication to LPS and to your role as a board member. I would now like to read a resolution that was issued for the month of January by the Wayne County Regional Educational Service Agency's Board of Education. Whereas the boards of education of the 33 constituent school districts of Wayne County promote quality education for all children attending their local schools, and whereas these committed public servants demonstrate dedication to their civic duty and voluntarily contribute countless hours of service on behalf of the students of Wayne County and their communities, and whereas Wayne County school boards are strong advocates for the needs of their students in their communities and with policymakers in Lansing and Washington. And whereas Wayne County school boards regularly do all they can to ensure academic success for all Wayne County schools, and whereas Wayne County school board members support and participate in both community and school events, volunteering their time and resources, and whereas Wayne County school boards understand the importance of a quality education for its youth and recognize that this is the most important factor in the success of our local communities, state, and country. And whereas local control continues to play a vital role in the success of public education, and whereas the state of Michigan and the State Board of Education have declared January 2019 as School Board Recognition Month. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Wayne County Regional Educational Service Agency Board of Education, in the spirit of the School Board Recognition Month, recognizes, celebrates, and commends the dedication, contributions, and leadership of the Wayne County School Boards of Education. This was presented and adopted on December 19th, 2018, and signed by members of the Wayne Risa Board of Education. Okay, and now, on behalf of the Michigan Association of School Boards, we put together a very small little gift for each of you, which is on your chairs as you walked in. And we also have certificates, which read School Board Recognition Month, January 2019, Certificate of Appreciation for your dedication to our children and public education in Michigan. And President Johnson, if I may, present one to each board member.
Very well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stacy.
Thank you so much.
Now I'd like to turn it over to Superintendent Ellis, who has a few words to say as well.
Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins, and thank you for sharing that wonderful description of the important work that the Board of Education members in our community do on behalf of the students that we serve, the staff that we serve in our community overall. When President Johnson shared with you that there are many, many things that take place behind the scenes, we can certainly attest to that. In fact, there are many more hours spent behind the scenes than you may see here on TV in our meetings. This board is committed to meeting just about every week between our study sessions, our committee of the whole meetings, board workshops, and our board meetings. And the amount of time and effort and care and commitment that goes into the review of your weekly packet of information, the preparedness that you show for each and every meeting, but most importantly, the care and commitment that you show to our students and our staff. On behalf of our cabinet team and our entire district, we thank you for your service, and we are so grateful to have each of you at the helm.
Thank you, Mrs. Obrist. Very well. Questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Bonifield.
You look scared. I just
I never
wanna-
know what you're going to say.
I know. I'm a loose cannon, right?
You are.
So what I would like to say is that we appreciate the kudos, but it's definitely a two-way street. Our superintendent, our cabinet members, all of the staff of the district, it's just one big giant, let's get these kids educated, and I think we all work together, and we all work pretty seamlessly together, and I think as President Johnson noted earlier, we don't all agree all the time, but we come to our consensus and what's best for the kids, and that all comes from our cabinet and the rest of the staff. And so again, we can't do it by ourselves. It's definitely a group effort.
Thank you, Mrs. Bonifield. Well said.
Well said.
Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. We appreciate that. Then that'll take us to item 3B, Points of Pride, LPS Literacy and Instructional Coaching Program. Mrs. Jenkins.
Yes, thank you, President Johnson. Tonight it is my pleasure to bring back our Points of Pride feature, which we started adding to every agenda item back in the spring of 2017. We're reviving it now for the second semester of this school year. Our Points of Pride feature is an opportunity to highlight various programs throughout the district. And tonight we will be hearing from our team that comprises the LPS Instructional and Literacy Coaching Program. Implemented in phases, our coaching program offers supplementary support at the elementary level and has already proven to be an awesome addition to our classrooms. And I'm excited to introduce the team to you tonight. We've got they have a PowerPoint presentation as well. So presenting the overview will be Corrine Alt, and we've got the three instructional coaching leads here with us this evening. We've got Lauren Schnell and Jen Corey. So without further ado, Corrine Alt is going to lead you through the presentation.
Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for having us. We're very excited to share our coaching model with you. Lauren and I are going to co-present. So we want to get started by just saying how excited and passionate we are about the work that we're doing. And we feel like we are making gains already in the work that we have started. So I'm going to let Lauren talk a little bit about the history in LPS with regards to coaching before I explain the model.
Okay, yes, thank you. We're really excited to be here to talk about literacy coaching, and we appreciate the support of the Board of Education. Just to give you a brief history lesson, and there won't be a quiz, so don't worry. We've always had curriculum facilitators who've worked here in the Academic Services Department, and they've typically been classroom teachers. And their job was to provide professional development for teachers outside of the classroom and to kind of oversee curriculum. And they work in all areas, literacy, math, science, and social studies. The coaching program is a little bit different in that we are providing job-embedded professional development for teachers in their classroom on an ongoing basis. And so we're working more in schools rather than at central office. So that's kind of the big difference between the facilitators we've always had and the coaching, which is typically is a sort of a new initiative here in Livonia. So to the history part, during the 2016-17 school year, then Chief Academic Officer Sheila Ellis invited me to leave the classroom and to work as a literacy coach. And at that time, I was given the charge of working with all third grade teachers in the district at 11 different elementary schools. And the focus at that time was on small group instruction and guided reading. So I worked with teachers beginning in January through May, and then after that I worked a little bit with second grade teachers as well. Fortunately, due to the money we received from the Wayne County Enhancement Millage, we were able to expand the coaching team and hire 2 additional coaches. Corrine Alt, who came to us as an experienced coach from the Chicago Public Schools, and Jen Corey, who came to us an experienced coach from Hazel Park. So in addition to working with teachers, we also work with each other and learn from each other. So it's a really great, it's good synergy that we have going on. At the time, at that year, during that school year, each of us had assigned to us either 3 or 4 buildings. And we worked with teachers in grades K through 3. In the 2017-18 year, this year, we were able to, with the Enhancement Millage, also hire 2 additional elementary coaches, Larissa Burke, who was a teacher at Coolidge Elementary, and Jenny Bishakis, who is an experienced coach with a charter school. So now we have 5 elementary literacy coaches, and each of us has either 2 or 3 buildings. So we're able to make a bigger impact because we have fewer teachers to serve. So we're really grateful to be able to expand our team. And in addition, we have 3 instructional coaches. The difference is they work with 5-6 teachers at Riley, Cooper, and Johnson and Webster, and their focus is working with math as well as literacy. And we have Tara Daraskovich and Nicole McGlinch, who come from Cooper Elementary School, and Grace Guillermo, who comes to us from Detroit Public Schools as an experienced coach. So that's kind of the history of our coaching effort. I'm going to turn it back over to Corrine to explain kind of the theory of action behind coaching.
So this document that you see on the screen is the Literacy Theory of Action that was actually created by the General Education Leadership Network through the ISD's and Nell Duke's research work. They came together to create a plan for increasing student achievement in the area of literacy. And so we've used this to drive the work that we're doing here in LPS. So as you can see, we're right now, in terms of coaching, we're in the 3rd and 4th phase where it says embedded and sustained quality professional learning through coaching and developing teachers' instructional skills. So moving away from the one and done professional development that teachers are used to getting, where they go for a PD and then they're expected to do the work on their own. The work that the coaches are doing is job embedded, and they get regular support to increase student achievement in the area of literacy. So this theory of action has created the process that we have started with the literacy coaching and instructional model that we're using.
So in addition to the 10 essential practices for teaching literacy for teachers K-5, Gellin also came out with 10 essential practices for literacy coaching. So part of our work is we belong to a network of coaches across the state where we met a lot last year to learn together more about effective research-based practices for coaching. This year, we're kind of excited because our Chief Academic Officer, Teresa O'Brien, through a literacy grant, was able to provide funds for teachers to take 2 different modules at the Michigan Virtual University for some online learning. The 2 essentials they'll be studying are Essential 1, which is about student motivation and engagement, and Essential 7, which centers on vocabulary instruction. And that's kind of the instructional focus of the district this year. So with the funds from that grant, teachers will receive a stipend to take these 2 courses at home on their own time, and then it's about 4 hours of work on your own, and then meet with for an hour with their coach and other colleagues to kind of debrief the experience. So it's totally voluntary, but teachers will receive not only the professional learning and a stipend, but they can also receive credits toward their continuing education requirements. We're pretty excited to be able to offer that this year.
So the next slide that you're going to see talks about the student-centered coaching model that we're following. Across the nation, there are different coaching models that districts adopt, and the one that Livonia Public Schools feels passionate about in terms of the work that we do is focusing around student achievement. So this graphic or model shows the different stages of what that would look like. So I'm just going to talk briefly about it because students are at the center, so we always look at student data to start with, and then we move into setting goals based on standards. And this might be these are the steps that you would see in a typical coaching cycle that we engage in with teachers. So it's short bursts of time where we work with teachers for 4 to 6 weeks in a grade level, so that we're creating collaboration around the instruction that's happening across a 4th grade team or across a 1st grade team. So we start with the student data, then we set goals based on the standards, and then we help the teachers to break down the standards and create learning targets that are appropriate for the students, and then we would do some kind of pre-assessment that would help us to determine where the students are at and where we need them to be and what we need to do to get them there. So then you can see that last portion of the model shows the bulk of the time is in the co-planning and the co-teaching. So this is where the coaches come in to help we're part of the whole process, but the bulk of the time is spent on how are the teachers engaging the students in these lessons, and can the coaches support the teachers in these lessons through modeling or co-teaching. And then we come back to debrief and do a post-assessment so we can look at data to determine if the work that we have done has shown an impact. So we've been able to do these coaching cycles with grade level teams all the way from kindergarten to 4th grade. In the first year, the focus was K-3, but in this year, now that we have less buildings and we're able to target more teams of teachers, we're able to work with kindergarten through 4th grade using this model. So it helps in terms of keeping it short and in a time-bound cycle for teachers, so that they're not meeting with a coach all the time every week, but they're engaged in the process for 4 to 6 weeks, and then the coach works with another team of teachers. That doesn't mean that a coach can't work with individual teachers if teachers reach out to them, but the goal is to create collaboration and have the teachers go through a process of using standards and data to drive their instruction.
So as Green said, it's all about the data, right? The data's not good or bad, it's just the data. So we always start with not necessarily what teachers might want to focus on or learn about, but we look at the student data. We kind of focus on Dufour's questions. What do we want students to learn? How are we going to teach them? What will we do if they don't learn? And what will we do with students who already know what we want to teach them? So that kind of drives our work with teachers. We look at the data. It could be from the iReady diagnostic that's given 3 times a year. It could be data collected through a common assessment at the school, part of the school improvement plan. It could be data that teachers have collected through observation or other work in the classroom. But that data helps us to develop a focus, and then with that focus, we always tie the work to a standard. So we have standards-based reporting, so we want to make sure our teaching is focused on the data, what the data shows us, and on a standard that we can measure. So we help, as Corrine said, we set goals with the teachers. We develop learning targets for students. We have formative assessments along the way, so we don't wait till the end of coaching, but we collect data along the way so we can adjust what we're doing as we're doing it. And develop sometimes a performance task with success criteria, so we know exactly what we're going to expect students to do so that we can look along the way and see if we're preparing them as the work goes on. And as Corrine also mentioned, we are working in short cycles with teachers. A cycle could last anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks, depending on the focus and on the instruction. We can offer modeling, we can co-teach with teachers, we can observe and offer feedback, but the gold standard really is co-teaching, working together, presenting together. It's really exciting when teachers are brave enough to have us co-teach with them, because that's what it's really all about. When you observe teachers, it almost feels like you're assessing them, but we're not assessing, we're really just working beside them. And really, when I'm observing a teacher, I'm really not looking at the teacher, but I'm watching the students. How are they responding to the instruction? And then afterwards, we can debrief, whether we've co-taught, observed, or modeled. We can debrief about what the teacher observed and what we might do differently next time.
So the main focus of all of this is collaboration. We want teachers to feel supported. We want teachers to feel like we're partners in the learning process with them and in the teaching process. So we don't want there to be a division in terms of teachers against the coaches. That we want it to be, we're teachers just like you are. We've been in the classroom, we've done the hard work, and we want to support you in that work. But we want teachers to see coaching as a collaborative process and create a culture for that, so that teachers feel like it's a privilege to have a coach and to work with a coach. Just like when you think about a sports model, even the top professionals have coaches to help them hone their practice. And we want teachers to feel that way. So we want it to be something that they feel empowered by, and that they feel like they're getting a lot out of the process. So that being said, we have asked a teacher to come and say a few words about the process. Kim McConsick has graciously agreed. She's a 4th grade teacher at Coolidge, and I'm actually engaged in a coaching cycle with her right now at this time. So I felt that it was a great opportunity for her to speak a little bit about it, the process from a teacher's perspective.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Mrs. Alt, Mr. Schnell. Good evening, board members, Superintendent Oquist. Thanks for having me tonight. I'm really excited to be here. Working with Corinne is amazing. I've worked with Lauren in different capacities, and he's amazing as well. But I can only speak with Corinne in this regard. She hinted at it earlier in saying that she's available as a resource for teachers outside of this coaching model. And I've taken advantage of it. I know many teachers have taken advantage of it. I've seen Corinne with teachers at lunch hours, before school, after school, whenever. She's really flexible with working with us whenever it is works for our schedules. And lots of different things, right? Analyzing our own student data, helping to find the right goals for our growth plans, for helping with small group instruction, where to go, especially formulating small groups, looking at all of this iReady data, like where do we go when you've got all these kids everywhere. So she's been a real resource for that. So thank you for that. In regards to the coaching cycle, we're just a few weeks into our cycle now. In speaking with my team, the things that we like the best about it are that, number one, we are really getting to know the standards. You look at, even as educators, you look at these standards and they are meaty and they are wordy, and sometimes you're like, how in the world am I going to digest this? So it helps us to really unpack it and look at it closely. We get to know them in a really intimate way. Also, it's very data-driven, which we love that too. We're looking at always increasing student achievement. That's our number one goal at Coolidge, always. So we take that data and using the pre-test and the post-test. Now, in our coaching cycle now, we did use a standards mastery and well, we haven't gotten to the post, but we will, on the iReady. So that is a nice feature too that we're using that helps guide where we want the students to go. We are working a little bit with, well, I shouldn't say a little bit, all of our focus is on writer's craft and structure, but Corinne's helping us to bring together pieces of vocabulary as well as text-dependent analysis, kind of bridging the gap between literature and informational text as well, and creating these units. So it's been really a pleasure working with her. I'm learning a lot as a teacher. I love that. We're most excited about, again, they hinted or talked a little bit about this, but we're most excited about the modeling and co-teaching that is coming in the next week or two with us. Corinne just set up like a learning lab type thing for us, so we'll be able to see her model some lessons with the students and then have that time to walk away, debrief, and collaborate together and figure out where to go from here and how we can implement these things into our classrooms. I really think that's the best thing about the coaching cycle is that collaborative time with your team, and the coaches bring a focus to it and maybe a little bit of a facilitation sometimes you need when you get a group of people together, and it's just been a great resource for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
We'd like to open it up if you have any questions. We're happy to answer them if you have any that you would like to address to us or to Kim. And Teresa's also here to answer any questions about the history and the model that we are using.
Sure. Questions or comments? Mrs. Burton.
Got a few. How is the whole concept being received by the teachers? I imagine that, and we talked about this a bit in our study session. We were talking about the whole concept over the last couple of years. That my guess is that most teachers are going to be pretty excited about it. But I also, looking at human nature, that there may be some resistance or some concern. Lauren, you alluded to a little bit of concerned that they're being evaluated, and that's not really the goal of the program. So how is it being received by teachers overall, and how do we deal with those that may feel a little bit threatened by it?
Sure, that's an excellent question, and really it's all about relationships. So I know the first half year that I was working, it was all about building relationships. I was fortunate enough to know most of the teachers that I was working with. When Corrine and Jen joined the team, they came from outside the district, they knew nobody. So they really had to work on building relationships. So it's building the relationship, establishing trust, and just once teachers find out you're there to help them, then they really want you to help them and be in their classroom with them. So it's about getting them to understand that we recognize how much they have on their plates. They're being asked to do a lot. And we're fortunate to have a lot of really hardworking teachers in Livonia. So it's really a plus. But once they see we're there to kind of help them, as Corrine said, collaborate, kind of tie everything together so that they see how everything fits together. And we're not an extra thing they have to do, but we're really there to help them with the things they already have to do. They're more than willing to work with us. So it's just that idea of establishing trust and getting people to understand our role and what we're there to help them do.
Okay.
I have just one thing to add, and I think in the initial phases, people were, reluctant, especially to work with somebody they don't know, and they're like, who is this person coming from Chicago? And so again, like Lauren said, it took time for me to build trust in terms of the work that we were going to do together. But I was fortunate enough to have teams that were willing to be the first team to work. I think a lot of the work that we've done has been very transparent in terms of it. We didn't just come in and say we're going to work with this team, and then teachers are like, well, why are you starting with us? There was a lot of teacher input, and in terms of the school decision-making process for how we would go about coaching teachers and what team would start the process. So I feel like having teachers know what the reasoning behind it is and why we're here. Again, we shared the same information with teachers that we want this to be a positive experience. We want this to be something that helps you and benefits you. We don't want it to be you have to do this kind of thing. We want it to be like, wow, I get to work with a coach. But it takes time to develop that. And the one thing that I've noticed is that success breeds success. So when you work with a team of teachers and they get results with the work, they tell everybody on their staff. And then the other teams want to be part of that process too. So when you have teachers who are willing to put themselves out there and try something new and it works really well, that helps encourage other teachers to do the same thing.
And that leads me exactly into my next question, which was, have you seen measurable results yet on it? Yes, no, does it take more time than we have right now? Who wants to take a stab at that one?
It's a process, right?
Well, do you want to
I
dive in
can
there?
start. I think
It sounds like that's, a lot of us are saying, that's the bottom line. Is it working?
so. So Jen and Lauren and I, because this is our second year, we're starting to see more measurable results in year 2 because we've had the time to build relationships and we've sort of developed the process a little bit more. Some of the coaching cycles that we did the year before, might have gone longer than expected or had some hiccups along the way. But when what we found is that depending on the focus, and again, the teachers get to choose the focus. We don't come in and say, this is what you have to work on. The teachers decide what the focus is. We see measurable results in a very specific area. So if we see a team of, if we see student data that shows that the students are low performing in phonics or phonemic awareness, we can drill down to that very specific area, do a pre-test, do some explicit teaching around it, and do a post-test, and we get results. The thing is it doesn't always translate to guided reading levels, or that the student is now not a struggling student versus a high-performing student, because again, that takes time. So you would see results within the 4 to 6 week coaching cycle, but then the hope is that we're building capacity with teachers so that then they're able to replicate that process in their classroom without a coach right beside them, and then we'll see greater results in more targeted areas. So the hope is every year there's going to be an increase in measurable results for student achievement.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and I can just say briefly that I know with teams that I've worked with, focusing on some skill-based intervention tied to text, we've seen growth. So in iReady, when you get the report, there are students who appear in red, meaning they're more than two or more years below grade level, yellow if it's within a year, and then green if they're where they should be. So we've seen a lot of movement after doing some skill-based intervention. And when the students took iReady again, we saw a lot of movement from red to yellow, yellow to green, and even some reds to green, which is always exciting and really hard to do. So it's always exciting when you get the data. And like Corinne said, success breeds success. So when other teachers hear that a grade level has had success, they're anxious to get started with the coaching too. And I know this year in the fall, I had teachers sign up for a coaching cycle, and it was like the last team to log in got the first spot, right? Because nobody wanted to be first. The second round, everybody was trying to get the first spot. So that made me feel really good. So I think that teachers are seeing success and feeling successful.
And I would just like to thank, too, our community, our Livonia community and our Wayne County community, because it's in large part due to the Wayne County Enhancement Millage that we're able to financially support this program.
Absolutely.
And with reading being so vital, we're trying to get programs where we can get the biggest bang for our buck. And as you alluded to, it's nice that this is not just a one-time shot, but this is teaching teachers how to be better teachers. So it's going to pay off down the road also. Thank you to our community for supporting indirectly, but they gave the support, and we chose how to use it as best we could with the recommendation of our administration. So it's exciting to see the progress. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Any other questions or comments? It's always nice to see. Did you have?
Just to say thank you for the work. It's so important. And Kim, thank you on behalf of the teachers that you guys are working so hard and diligently with building your capacity. I think that's phenomenal that we are building stronger teams for the kids. So thank you for your work. It is so important. So thank you.
Mrs. Bradford.
I echo the same sentiments. I'm thrilled with the coaching program. I think it's wonderful. I hope we can continue it for many years and every year just build upon it and get more of the teachers involved and interested and willing to participate. And I also want to thank our community for the Wayne County Enhancement Millage, because without that, we would not have this wonderful program. And thank you for all that you do. Thank you, Kim, and all the coaches.
Thank you, Mrs. Bradford. Mrs. Oak.
Defer to
Mr. Centers.
Yeah, I just, it's been a few years, but I've been in the classroom. I know it's probably hard for a lot of teachers to be vulnerable to their opening up themselves for scrutiny, especially now when there's more scrutiny than ever on teachers. There's been legislatively, there's been a lot of pressure, as a whole on teachers. So I think the fact that people are increasingly open to coaching and really kind of putting aside their egos so that they can grow, I think is a great thing. It is challenging to, especially when people have done things well for a lot of years, to try to change that when there's a lot of change going on in a lot of ways in education. So, everyone who's working hard to get better, we certainly appreciate that.
If I can just make one comment about that, I just wanted to say that I do think that it's really valuable when teachers have the opportunity to collaborate. And unfortunately, we all know that there's very little time in the day to do that. And I think when teachers have a thought partner that they can engage with and they have someone to help facilitate that process, it becomes something that they need rather than something that they have to do. And I feel like teachers do have to put themselves out there to try new things, but I think in this case, oftentimes teachers are left to fend for themselves, and then they struggle with that because they don't have that collaboration. So I think having a coaching model in place allows for more collaboration, but also that that opportunity to step outside of your comfort zone and try new things in a safe place, because if you go to your administrator, they're evaluating you, so it's a little bit harder to say, I'm not really sure how to do this, can you give me some support with this? But if you can go to a trusted colleague to do that and you feel like you have the opportunity to grow and develop and get better at something, I think that is a really important aspect of education that is missing in a lot of districts. So I commend the school board for supporting that and helping us do the work that we need to do to develop and increase student achievement.
Mrs. Oquist.
Okay. Mrs. Jarvis, did you want to?
Oh, Mrs. Chair, I wish I had 180-degree vision. Mrs. Jarvis.
Thank you. I just wanted to commend everyone involved in this program. When we invest in our staff, that's our greatest resource. And it gives them additional tools in their toolbox. And it not only improves student life today, but also tomorrow. These are things that our staff can take with them as they move in their careers, and they're going to, that ripple effect, it's going to affect children year after year after year. And this is during a time when it's really tough to be a teacher, especially in literacy. There's so much pressure. And I just appreciate everything that's being done to help show that support and to make this a really viable program in the district.
Thank you, Mrs. Jarvis. Anybody else down
I
there?
think it's safe now. So I just want to spend just a few more moments on this, because this was a really significant ask of our Board of Education last spring when we came to you and asked to increase the number of not only literacy coaches but instructional coaches for our district. And if we think about the work that we ask teachers to do every single day in the classroom, it has become increasingly complex. We have learners who have needs that vary well beyond that grade level. And so we may have a classroom of 27 third graders, but those third graders may have reading needs that are at a first grade level or at a seventh grade level. Mathematic needs that may be just the opposite. We ask them to be experts in reading and writing, speaking and listening, all strands of the literacy curriculum, as well as math and science and social studies. And by the way, we ask them to build a really strong, positive, engaging climate and culture. So that is no easy task. And we are so happy to have this additional support as a direct support to our teachers. And Kim, I really appreciate your comments this evening as well, because it really shines a light on the support that we can provide to our staff so that you can in turn do this essential work each day with the students entrusted to you. So the impact we hope we will see not only in those coaching cycles with regard to some of the pre and post assessments, but as we grow the capacity of our teachers to be able to meet the needs of our learners and be able to look at data. Maybe initially that's a really complex process to look at that data and plan for instruction across 25 to plus students. But as we become better at that and more adept, and we have the ability to have opportunities to co-teach and to have teaching modeled to us and then be able to debrief and collaborate, that's really sustainable and impactful professional development. And this is a model that without question is the model that research has shown has the most impact on the growth and development of our staff. So we're not only appreciative of the coaches and the work that you're doing, Mrs. O'Brien in leading our coaches as our Chief Academic Officer, and Christine Fenkel as our Literacy Coordinator, but really to each of the teachers who have stepped forward to be part of this process. So thank you to the school board for trusting us with this recommendation. You may see a very similar recommendation and a little more come to you this spring, but we believe that the investment in our staff is truly an investment in our students, and we really are so grateful for what you've shared with us this evening. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? So one of the drawbacks of being the president, everybody else already has their ideas and I sort of mop up. But one of the things we as the board have to do is our long-term, our financial stability. And we have to evaluate programs and we have to prioritize. Where are we going to get, as Mrs. Burton said, the best bang for our buck? And we have to look at the return on our investment. And it certainly looks like this program, we're getting that return. So this is one program that I think we all agree was a good choice. And just keep up the good work. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for your support.
Thank you.
Okay, that'll move us on to item 3C, update from the superintendent. Mrs. Oquist.
Thank you, President Johnson. So we do have some exciting things to share with our community this evening. to recognize our students, our staff, our district, and some of our schools. So first of all, we'd like to share that the Livonia Chamber of Commerce has selected Livonia Public Schools to be the 2019 recipient of the Community Enhancement Award. We are truly honored to receive this award. We'd like to thank our entire community for the support of the 2013 bond, which has allowed us to complete really significant and impactful renovations and updates over the past 5 years. We have certainly found this to be a huge point of pride for all who live and learn in our district, and we thank the Chamber for this special recognition. LPS will be recognized at the annual Leadership Dinner and Awards Banquet later this month. And I believe all of our board and I will be in attendance, and many members of our cabinet team. So we have some good news to share with regard to speed limits around schools. We had a very dedicated crossing guard who serves the Hayes community present a very compelling case in petition to the Westland City Council and the Westland Police Department, who have in turn agreed to reduce the speed around Hayes Elementary the hour before school starts and the hour after school starts. He had quite a few concerns. He shared with them quite a bit of evidence and data. And so I'd like to thank our crossing guard for not only advocating, but for the Westland City Council and the Westland Police Department for their responsiveness. So we are pleased to report that change will be underway very soon. We'd like to give an update on Girls Who Code. We had female students from Churchill, Franklin, and Stevenson recently attend a Girls Who Code 12-week program at the Civic Center Library. Co-founders of the program are parents Zheng Yu and Ni Derry, Livonia Robotics team mentors. Students learn the basics of computer programming and how to write code instructions, including components of a website that the group created from scratch. So we'd like to acknowledge students from those schools for participating. We'd like to give a shout out to Benji C., who has won the National Geography Bee for Webster. The first runner-up was Chinmaya, and the second runner-up was Chloe. Congratulations to those participants. Benji will be taking the state qualifying test soon, and we wish him a lot of luck. The Livonia Rotary Club recently presented its first Vocational Service Award, and it went to our very own Gabe Quigley as the 2019 recipient. He's a senior at Churchill High School. He's also a member of the LCTC Construction Trades Program. This is a new award that the Rotary is giving out, and it's designed to be given to a high school student who has made a commitment to earning vocational job placement skills while completing their academic education. It's for students who demonstrate honesty in work, life, and school, have the ability to lead, and be a part of a work team where the needs of other members come before their own personal needs. So we congratulate Gabe, and thank you to the Livonia Rotary for their continued support and partnership of our students. We had some excitement over at Stevenson. Their POM team were recently crowned state champs for Division II at the Mid-American Pom-Pom competition in East Lansing. We'd like to congratulate this hardworking and talented team as well as their coaches. I believe the banner will be hanging soon in the Stevenson gym. Recently, we had an opportunity, a number of us, to attend the Young Inventors Workshop Showcase. This was a program that kicked off in the fall, sponsored by the Chamber, and also many of our local businesses and Schoolcraft College. We had over 800 middle school students in Livonia, Clarenceville, and Wayne Westland participate in designing inventions that met a need that they felt existed in the community. So last month, the top 35 entries were displayed, and the inventors were recognized during a wonderful dinner and ceremony at Schoolcraft College, which was hosted by the Chamber and Alpha USA. It was a great evening. The awards event had a Shark Tank theme with actually someone wearing a shark suit, which was exciting in and of itself. But taking first place in the contest amongst all of the students who entered was Hannah Heskett, an Emerson Middle School student in Livonia Public Schools. She invented the raccoon can't can, which prevents critters from getting into trash cans. It was quite a wonderful idea, and it was intriguing to the judges, and she was selected to win the first place award. And third place went to Grace Holman, a Holmes Middle School student who invented the bat warmer to solve the issue, which exists apparently in baseball and softball bats when it becomes too cold and they begin to crack. And so both of them had some unique ideas. And I'd like to thank Dan West, the president and CEO of the Chamber of Commerce, who said that all of the students are to be commended for their creative inventions and for their bravery in presenting their inventions to an audience of over 250 people. So it was a great night. The Young Inventors program is always exciting. It's kicked off with some wonderful mentors in the fall, and then students have time to identify and create their inventions, and it was a terrific evening. So we have a few announcements. If you can believe it, kindergarten registration has begun for the class of 2032. Now think about your varsity jacket and what was on the shoulder. I don't think it was a 32. So to assist families in registering, we're once again going to offer a special Saturday registration. That makes it a little easier if folks can't get to schools during the day. That will be held on February 23rd at Riley Upper Elementary. As of today, we still have about 30 appointments available online. So you just need to go to our website. You can sign up online, and we'll get you registered on a Saturday. Otherwise, you just stop in at your assigned elementary school, and we will be very happy to welcome you. So apparently, we had a number of folks already there on Friday, which was the first day of registration for kindergarten. So we welcome you. Our robotics teams, the Livonia Warriors and the Tyros team, will be kicking off their winter competition season in mid-February, and we'd like you to mark your calendars for a very special competition that is held annually at Churchill High School. It's at the end of spring break? Or beginning? End of the last weekend of spring break, Friday, April 5th and Saturday, April 6th. Matches run from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. each day. Be sure to stop in and see the extraordinarily talented teams, not only from our district, but from across the entire state. At Churchill High School, yes. And as you know, Livonia Public Schools has begun to offer 2 new athletic offerings this year, lacrosse and bowling. Our bowling teams are on fire, and they're doing a terrific job and creating some very exciting matches across the region. But we have lacrosse that will be starting in the spring. So both of the meetings, those are mandatory parent meetings, are going to be taking place this week. They were rescheduled from those cold days last week. So I wanted to just make a mention that this is for parents and players. The boys will be meeting on Thursday, February 7th in the cafeteria at Stevenson at 7 p.m. The girls will be meeting on Wednesday, February 6th at 7 p.m., also in the North Cafeteria at Stevenson. As a reminder, since these are unified teams, these meetings are for students from Churchill, Franklin, or Stevenson who plan to participate in the lacrosse tryouts this spring. And then if you are looking for an entertaining evening out or wondering what you might do with a Valentine, I'd like to offer the opportunity for you to see Kappa's presentation of Peter Pan. So that will be taking place February 15th to the 17th. That will be their inaugural performance in the PAC there at Churchill. And you can visit our website and order tickets online. Finally, I just wanted to express a sincere thank you to Senator Polhanke, who was recently sworn in her role. As she visited our district a couple of weeks ago, we were able to engage in some really important dialogue about the needs of the district, our learners, our community, and public education in general. I truly appreciate her early involvement in issues of importance to our students and to Livonia Public Schools. So that is it for this evening, and I appreciate the time to share some great news with our community about Livonia Public Schools.
You must be tired.
I've got a lot of energy.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist. At this point, as I indicated, we're going to take just a very short break, about 5 minutes or so, and we will be back on. Thank you. All right, we're back, and we'll move on with our agenda. Item 3D, written communications. I do not have any written communications. Any written communications? Seeing none, we'll move on to item E, audience communication. I don't see any blue slips. I don't see anyone bringing a blue slip, so I won't give my 20-minute diatribe on audience communication. We'll move on to item 3F, response to prior audience communication. Is there any response? Seeing none, then we'll move on to item 4, consent agenda. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Burton?
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the following consent agenda items as recommended by the superintendent. 5A, minutes of the regular meeting of December 17th, 2018. 5B, minutes of the special meeting of January 28th, 2019. 5C, minutes of the closed session of January 28th, 2019.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Bradford. Any questions, comments on the consent agenda? Seeing none, Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes, motion carries. Thank you, Mrs. Bonnefield. And pass down our, thank you. All right, that'll move us down to item 6, instructional matters. Item A, limited schools of choice for 2019-2020. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Jarvis?
move that the Board of Education of Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the superintendent to participate in limited schools of choice under Section 105 and 105C for the 2019-2020 school year. Openings to include no more than 185 seats in kindergarten through 8th grade, and 5 seats in each Global Ed and Kappa at 9th grade only, for a total of up to 195 students.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mr. Centers. Mr. McDonald, are you going to help us with this?
I will tonight. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
President Johnson. As a reminder, we began doing school of choice in the 2014-2015 school year. When we refer to Section 105, that is for students living within Wayne County, and 105C for those living in the contiguous counties to Wayne. We received the lesser of the two foundation allowances for each student, and the potential revenue, if we were to fill all 195 students, in this case would be a little over $1.5 million. If approved tonight, we would begin to publicize this program through our social media and our website, and then we would have an application window from February 28th through March 29th.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Burton?
Yes, Mr. McDonald or Mrs. Oakwith, I'm not sure who is best to answer this. If you could refresh my memory, is it about 67-70% retention of students for the open number of slots that we opened up last year?
So in the past, up until this past year, it's been right around the 82% mark. Our past year was around 67%.
Okay, so if we're looking at 195 seats, if we're looking even, whether it's last year or previous years, we're not going to be looking at
Probably
likely
not.
enrolling 195. We're looking at a chunk less than that.
Correct.
Perhaps around the 150-ish range or so.
Yep.
And again, just so our public understands, this is a limited schools of choice. It's not an open, opening the doors for anyone and everyone who wants to come in. But these 150-ish so seats that we anticipate garnering from this 195 seat opening would be spread across our 24 school buildings.
In grade levels. from
And
K to
at all grade levels. So we're talking about literally 1 or 2 kids per grade per building is what it kind of boils down to. And this is, I'm in support of this program because I believe that it does go a long way to helping retain the programs that we have in place for our students. It does also help to fill a few holes of classes where we might have to have a split class. We have fewer split classes because we can channel a few students into a given grade in a given building if we know that we are lacking a few that might allow us to have a full class as opposed to a split class. But if we can put some students into some of these classes and not have to hire extra staff to take care of them because we have just some holes and some pockets throughout the district, and therefore continue serving the needs of all of our students so well, I'm very much in favor of this program.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Other questions or comments? Mrs. Jarvis.
I just wanted to share that in the break that we just had, a parent came up to me who is one of our current schools of choice parents. She had seen this on our agenda and was concerned at the possibility of losing this program, which she was absolutely, adamantly in favor of keeping it, and was just sharing with me how much she appreciates having the opportunity to have her child in Livonia Public Schools, and just was relating the successes that her child has had and the improvements over the previous school. And it, we don't often get to hear that. We don't see the other side of it. As a parent, we all want what's best for our child, and we are so fortunate to have that opportunity to share what we know is best, which is Livonia Public Schools, and offer that to so many other children.
Thank you, Mrs. Jarvis. Other questions or comments? Mrs. Burton. Oh.
I think you were clear on this, Mr. McDonald, but I just wanted to. It says limited schools of choice, just so everyone knows that this is out of district students. You said Wayne County.
Correct.
It is out of district. We're not talking about any intra-district transfers, anybody who's going to different schools. That is more of an administrative policy that the board would not get involved with. Just to be clear, even though it says schools of choice, it's not meaning our own students' schools of choice.
That is correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Do you have another question?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
For those folks who may not have followed our previous study session or committee of the whole, this board consistently, each time that this topic comes up, and it's been for the last few years now, asks if we are having any unusual behavior issues or academic issues that would be outside of what we would expect from our typical LPS community, and are assured that the kids that we're bringing in as schools of choice are like everybody else's kids. That's on the whole, their students are doing quite well in our school district. One thing that does definitely help is that parents or guardians are responsible for transporting their students to and from Livonia Public Schools each day. So you have, by that very requirement, you have some families who have the time and desire and resources to be able to get their kids here every single day. That's some pretty dedicated folks, and generally some pretty dedicated students. So I wanted to just put folks' concerns at ease that we are not having additional behavioral or academic issues or any fewer services for Livonia Public School students. One of the questions was raised is, if my child needs resource room attention or something similar to that, would they be receiving less of that? And we are assured that they would not be receiving any less services, because those types of services are designed on a ratio. A certain number of students has a certain number of staff assigned. So the Livonia Public Schools, folks who live in the district, absolutely are going to be served, and this is not going to be a lesser of a service to our folks who live in our community, but rather it's filling some holes that would otherwise go without students in them. Also, if anyone's considering this kind of a program, once a student is in Livonia Public Schools through an out-of-district school of choice program, then they would stay in Livonia Public Schools. It is a commitment. As long as they are continuing to attend regularly, it is a commitment that our district makes to that family. So it's not like you're going to be able to come into the district for 1 year and maybe not come in the next year. Once they are admitted through the Schools of Choice program, they're going to be able to stay in our district, again, provided that any other, through any other requirements that would be there through folks who live in our district. But that's an ongoing commitment that Livonia Public Schools is making to that student and that family. I think it's a terrific program.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mr. Centers, to approve the limited schools of choice for 2019 2020. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll?
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes, that motion carries. Thank you. That moves us to item 6B, approval of bid results for website hosting. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Bradford.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the recommendation to contract with Blackboard Incorporated for website design and hosting services for a period of 3 years, with 2 optional 1-year extensions for a startup cost of up to $18,400 and an annual operating cost of up to $39,560 for each year of the contract. The service includes a built-in ADA compliance tool and a fully integrated mobile app.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mrs. Jarvis. And, oh, there you are. I was looking for you.
Hi.
Mrs. Jenkins is going to help us.
Thank you, President Johnson. After several months of study, live demonstrations with 4 K-12 website providers, a very detailed RFP process, a pre-bid meeting, and post-bid follow-ups, my committee and I bring forth the recommendation to contract with Blackboard for a new website design and hosting services, as well as was stated in the motion, a built-in ADA compliance tool and an interactive mobile app. We're excited to embark on this improvement for our students, parents, staff, and the community, and feel that Blackboard's features and service model will best meet our needs. Our website represents the view that the outside world has of our district, and we want to be sure that we are more than adequately representing LPS in the best light for potential families who may be considering moving into the district. We also strongly desire to have an interactive site and mobile app that will serve as a reliable tool for students, staff, and parents to not only obtain important information, but to also be able to interact with these tools as needed for school-related business. It's our recommendation that the district contract with Blackboard for the dollar amount stated in the motion.
Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. Questions or comments from the board? Seeing none. Could you just explain a little bit the ADA compliance for those people who may be listening and not sure what that is?
Sure. LPS, like several districts all around the country, and particularly in the state of Michigan, we have been working tirelessly over the past maybe 3 years on improving ADA accessibility on our website for folks with ADA type issues such as low vision. The way in which we are posting our content must be by law ADA compliant. Blackboard has a built-in ADA compliance tool that will continuously crawl our web pages and in real time alert us when there is an issue. So currently we do contract with an outside company. The tool is not as robust as the one that we're recommending.
Oh, excellent.
Yep.
Thank you.
We'd have a savings then.
Yes.
No longer carrying.
Yes, as far as the price breakdown, there may be a slight savings in that, going with the bundle as opposed to paying individually.
Okay.
Contracting with a separate company.
Thank you. Mrs. Burton.
Assuming this is approved this evening, do you know when this can take place?
Well, we have a July 1 launch date already set, just kind of building from July 1, building backwards. So we're ready to get to work. It's a huge undertaking. Vast improvements are heading our way, so we're very excited.
Terrific. And I understand that one of the big benefits is that it's much more user-friendly on the part of the teachers, and that therefore they can be putting up more effective communications for their students and their families. So it'll be benefiting our students in addition to our community who's reaching into the district via our website.
That's absolutely correct. Our teachers will be pleased with what we'll be putting forth.
Terrific.
Large improvement.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, for the approval of bid results for website hosting. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes, motion carries. It takes us to item 7, which is business matters. Item A, approval of Barton Mallow Extension Agreement. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mr. Centers.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the extension agreement with Barton Mallow for the 2013 Bond Technology Design Services. The total cost of the extended agreement is $293,425.
Support.
We have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Frank. And Mr. Francis, you're going to help us with this evening?
Yes, sir. I'm going to fill
Thank
in
you.
for Mrs. Smith this evening on this topic. The original agreement that the district established with Barton Mallow was from August 2013, working throughout the bond. The extent of the technology design work has changed since the inception of that agreement. So while the technology bond work was to be completed by the end of 2018, we now anticipate finishing the work by the end of 2019. As discussed previously with the board, first we had Mr. Lindner from Owner's Rep Plant Moran come in and give a detailed backstory with regard to technology work done by Barton Mallow throughout the bond. And there was discussion about what added items and items that were taken off through some school closures, et cetera, and how that played out. There were more, there's added scope that the district requested on the original contract. And additionally, with the Nicci Aero renovation that's coming up this summer, there is, of course, an extension to the timeline and work scope for Barton Mallow. So with all of that, we are recommending extending the agreement with Barton Mallow via the change order process as presented in detail during the committee of the whole meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Questions or comments? Seeing none, I just make sure that what we're doing here, this is for work that they have done that exceeded the original scope that they have not been paid for.
It's been placed into two different buckets, so to speak. We have two different change orders. One, the extra work we asked them to do while they were still under contract during and through 2018. And then the second one being the Nicci Aero project and the added scope that we're asking them to go beyond now into 2019. All of which, at the time, Barton Mallow was being a good partner and working in good faith to accomplish the projects that we had asked them to do, all with the understanding that the district would eventually get together with them and work out this extension.
Okay, great. Thank you. Other questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Frank, for the approval of Barton Mallow Extension Agreement. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll?
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes, motion carries. Thank you. That takes us to item 7B, approval of bid results for construction at Nicci Aero Elementary 2013 bond. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson?
Mrs. Bonnefield.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the recommendation from the owner's representative, Plant Moran Cressa, to approve the construction project budget for Nicci Aero in the amount of $2,566,328, which includes hard construction fees and contingency, and authorizes superintendent or her designee to negotiate and execute final contracts with the recommended contractors.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, and again, Mr. Francis.
Yes, the recommended contractors that are listed in the packet for the construction 2019 summer projects will provide the work needed to complete the planned bond fund renovation at Nicci Aero. I do recommend authorizing the superintendent to enter into contracts with the listed vendors in order to move forward with the Nicci Aero bond construction project. And as a side note, we're all very excited in this extra phase of the bond construction project coming up this summer.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, to approve the bid results for construction and Nicci 2013 bond. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll?
Mrs. Benefield says yes. Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
President Johnson?
Yes, that motion carries. That brings us to item 7C, approval of bid results for move management at Nicci 2013 bond. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Frank?
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the recommendation from the owner's representative, Plant Moran Cressa, to approve DMS Moving Systems, Canton, Michigan, for move and IT move management at Nicci Elementary in the amount of $37,450 and a contingency budget amount of $5,500 for a total amount of $42,950, and authorize the superintendent or her designee to negotiate and execute final contracts.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Burton. Mr. Francis, you're up again.
This project will provide complete move management at Nicci Elementary School. This is a required need in preparation for and completion of the Nicci bond construction project as mentioned. So this, the recommendation, or I do recommend DMS Moving Systems to the board. They will be fulfilling both the furniture, et cetera, move as well as the IT and tech move in and out of the building.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Burton, for the approval of bid results for move management at Nicci 2013 bond. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll?
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes, motion carries. That takes us to item 7D, approval of security contractor for Nicci Elementary 2013 bond. May I have a motion?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Burton?
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the recommendation from the owner's representative, Plant Moran Cressa, to approve security designs, Livonia, Michigan, for security at Nicci Elementary in the amount of $14,177 and a contingency budget amount of $3,000 for a total amount of $17,177, and authorize the superintendent or her designee to negotiate and execute final contracts.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Bradford. Mr. Francis?
President Johnson, continuing the theme with the 2013 bond construction work at Nicci this project that we are discussing now will provide Nicci Elementary School with general security equivalent to other renovated buildings throughout the bond. Security Designs has been that security firm throughout the bond for the district, and I'm recommending retaining them for this bond construction project at Nicci Elementary via the change order process.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Burton?
Yes. Thank you. The board has been over this several times, but for the benefit of the public, will you just give a brief overview of what security items we're talking about?
Sure. One of the items that's most prevalently used or seen would be the secure vestibule that we have has a card access reader, A-phones, the buzzer in and out, if you will, to the building, along with card access readers at other entry points into the building on exterior doors, as well as the security alarm and those types of security issues.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Bradford, for the approval of security contractor for Nicci Elementary 2013 bond. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll?
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes, that motion carries. Thank you. This will be our last Nicci item. It is item E, approval of bid results for abatement contractor at Nicci Elementary 2013 bond. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson?
Mrs. Jarvis.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the recommendation from the owner's representative, Plant Moran Cressa, to approve Global Green Service Group, Dearborn Heights, Michigan, for abatement at Nicci Elementary in the amount of $21,263 and a contingency budget in the amount of $5,000 for a total amount of $26,263, and authorize the superintendent or her designee to negotiate and execute final contracts.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Frank. Once again, Mr. Francis.
Yes, this project, as you mentioned, is our final one to discuss with regarding to the 2013 bond construction at Nicci Elementary for this summer. It is the asbestos abatement for the school, and it's a necessary step prior to the full demolition of the building. So we do recommend Global Green Service Group for your approval for the abatement services, asbestos abatement and demolition of areas that contain asbestos prior to, again, being able to go in and do the other demolition, which would then lead to the renovation.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Bonnefield.
Mr. Francis, can you just cover briefly the safety precautions that we're taking? I know that we've talked about starting, as soon as we can on this project because Nicci has a different summer schedule than we do. And then I believe you talked about we have another service that actually comes in and monitors the abatement process, and just make sure that everybody knows that the students are going to be in no danger or anything like that.
Correct. They would not be doing the work while the students are with them, and Global Green is the company that would be doing the abatement. They follow all of their procedures, per law. But we also have retained Arch Environmental, who then is our consultant in this area, and they would be ensuring, as our representative of the district, that all guidelines are followed as well. So we have a check on the check to go, if you will, in this area. And Global Green, just to throw this out, Global Green has worked within the district via the bond and other services. They are a very reputable company, and we have been satisfied with their work that they have won via the bid process in the past.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Any other questions or comments? Mrs. Burton.
Just as a matter of clarification, when we're talking about demolition of the building, we're not talking about a complete demolition of the building. We're talking about just demolishing some portions of the interior to make sure that the renovations have space to happen.
Yes.
So we get it in this room.
Interior demolition,
make sure that
we're not
public's
raising
not
the
thinking we're
building,
taking the
correct.
building
Thank
down.
you.
Thank you for that clarification. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Frank, to approve the bid results for abatement contractor at Nicci 2013 bond. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, the motion carries. That takes us to item 7F, approval of bid results for paving projects at Coolidge, Emerson, Frost, and Churchill. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mr. Centers.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the recommendation from the owner's representative, Plant Moran Cressa, to approve T&M Asphalt, Milford, Michigan, for paving projects at Churchill High School, Coolidge Elementary, Emerson Middle School, and Frost Middle School, in the amount of $1,090,000 and a contingency budget amount of $109,000, for a total amount of $1,199,000, and authorize the superintendent or her designee to negotiate and execute final contracts.
Support.
We have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield. Mr. Francis.
Thank you. This project is a sinking fund project, and it will provide pavement repairs and updates at Churchill High School, Coolidge Elementary, Emerson Middle School, and Frost Middle School. These are planned projects for the summer in which they are part of the ongoing sinking fund plan across the district. I am recommending T&M Asphalt for your approval. This is a company that has worked in the district in previous paving projects before, has successfully completed those projects, and the district has been satisfied with their work.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have...
President Johnson?
Oh,
I have one.
that hand up.
I know, sorry.
Mrs. Frank.
So Mr. Francis and I had a brief discussion about this, but I just want to state it publicly too, that I think it's so important when we do these projects that we are not just repaving them. We do not have the funds at this time to build new parking lots and redo what is already there. But I also think we talked briefly, when these schools were built a long time ago, the parking lots were not made for as many students as have parents driving through them. I mean, the amount of parents that drive through the parking lots, drop off and pick up is substantial. And these parking lots are safety. You know, when we talk about secure vestibules and that sort of thing, our parking lots are also a huge safety, a spot where kids are running, not so much at the high schools, but they probably have student drivers and a lot of different issues than the elementary schools. So I just want to reiterate, and I know that you said you're going to follow up with Mr. Grizak on the Coolidge one, but just to connect with the principals and I know that we've done a lot of work, a lot of traffic studies and that sort of thing, but I think the principals know their parking lots the best and know the traffic flows and the traffic issues that are there. So although we're not reinventing the wheel, some of them are more extensive than others. Anytime that we go in there, I think restriping to make the flow better, finding parking spots where maybe there are not easy parking spots to find are vitally important. So when we're spending, over $1 million on parking lots, not to just resurface them, piecemeal it, but really to look at what we're doing and not that we can spend any more money, but in the amount of money that we have, what can we do to make it more efficient and more effective and safer for the students and the parents and the teachers that are out there, because some schools have a lot of teachers that are out there. But I just want to reiterate that we've got to connect with the schools, the principals, in terms of who is actually out there that sees what happens. Mr. Grizak, speaking of Coolidge, has been out there several times on the parent loop to just see exactly what's going on with it. And so I think that it's vitally important that we connect with them before we expend this kind of money. The principals need to be a vital voice in this. So I just wanted to reiterate that.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Mr. Centers.
Mr. Francis, just from my past experience on the board, we've usually talked with a point person at a building before doing any kind of major pavements, restriping, things like that. Is that the practice or?
Yes.
Okay, just want to make sure. Thank you.
Anything else? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Bonifield, for the approval of bid results for paving projects at Coolidge, Emerson, Frost, and Churchill. Mrs. Bonifield, would you take the roll, please?
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield says yes. Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
President Johnson?
Yes. Motion carries. Thank you, Mrs. Bonifield. That takes us to item 7G, approval of bid results for athletic field projects. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Bradford.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the recommendation from the owner's representative, Plant Moran Cressa, to approve athletic field improvements for Franklin High School and Stevenson High School in the amount of $2,157,800, plus contingency in the amount of $276,653, for a total of $2,434,453, and authorize the superintendent or her designee to negotiate and execute final contracts with the recommended contractors.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mr. Centers. Again, Mr. Francis.
Thank you. This sinking fund project will provide athletic field improvements at Franklin High School and Stevenson High School during the summer of 2019. This is actually phase 2 of the athletic fields renovation project, as Churchill High School was completed during the previous summer in 2018. Now, we're calling this athletic field projects, but just to clarify for the folks that might be hearing the comments for the first time, It's not just a field. We have tackled at Churchill and we'll be tackling at Stevenson and Franklin multiple areas that are not only the fields, but the surrounding areas of the fields. As an example, the track, fencing, dugouts, those types of items, even asphalt, et cetera, that are around the area. So this is more of a complex, and I don't mean complicated, but I mean the athletic complex area that is being worked upon. So just to clarify the title in the topic. With that, I recommend the board approve the listed vendors, or I am recommending to the board the listed vendors for your approval. And we are, again, excited to continue this work over the summer.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Questions or comments from the board? All I can say, if they do as good a job as they did at Churchill, it's going to be outstanding. Mrs. Bradford.
When can we anticipate that these projects will be completed?
Completed?
Or mostly completed?
Well, what we'll do is, because they do a cycle or a schedule, and we create a strict schedule with the contractors, and they prioritize the football / soccer / field, that main field, and that track area to be done in time for the fall season.
Right.
So if we look backwards as to what occurred in the summer of 18, the field at Churchill was released to the football team and to the coaches and the soccer, et cetera, to be used in August, shortly after they had begun their season. And so that is the same plan we will cycle through. Because baseball and softball is a spring sport, we save that then for when they're finished with the items that are using a fall sport.
Thank you.
Mrs. Bonnefield.
I just want to recognize Mr. Francis and his team. It always seems like we're talking about our buildings and our properties a lot, but it's a huge undertaking. And there's 1 million square feet? How much?
Of building?
Of buildings?
Over 3 million.
Over 3 million square feet. And then on top of that, the number of acres that.
Like 700.
Over 700.
Over 700 acres, thank you, that the district has to maintain. And the bond has gone a long way to making vital upgrades to our buildings, but just maintaining our properties, with paving and roofing and all that stuff is a huge undertaking for the district. And, it's part of the safety and the environment that our kids need to be in. And the second part of this, and this especially with the athletic fields, is that with the high schools, is that, we talk about equal or equitable. And I think Mr. Francis and his team take a lot of pride and care in making sure that the schools are equitable and the improvements that we're doing are equitable, and that they each have their own requirements and have spent a lot of time going to the athletic directors and the principals and, talking to people to make sure that the improvements are not the same at every building, but appropriate at every building. And it's a big deal in our district. We have a lot of buildings and a lot of property, and it's a big undertaking, and, it's crazy. So, and we're way behind because of the recession. So it seems like there's a lot that we're doing, but we're still playing catch up and probably will for a long time. So it's great that we can make these improvements and maintain our buildings and keep our facilities in proper working order.
Thank you, Mrs. Bonnefield. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mr. Centers, for the approval of bid results for athletic fields. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll?
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes, motion carries. That takes us to item 7H, approval of bid results for lawn equipment 2013 bond. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Frank.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the purchase of 3 Grasshopper Model 900D mowers from J&R Tractor LLC, Monroe, Michigan, for a total cost of $50,100.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mr. Burton. You got to be getting tired.
Mister.
Did I say Mr.?
Yes.
He wasn't going to vote.
They're going to impeach me. Mrs. Burton. Mr. Francis.
Thank you. So this purchase of the lawnmowers are slated to replace 20-year-old mowers at the 3 high schools, Churchill, Franklin, and Stevenson. We've had wonderful reliability and success with the Grasshopper brand, and the maintenance department and grounds department has been very satisfied with their performance, and thus we would like to stick with that specific brand. This is why we put out for the Grasshopper model. So at this point, with the success we've had in the near 30 years overall in the district with this brand, we bring to you the recommendation for the 3 mowers to be sent to the high schools to update their fleet, if you will.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Questions or comments from the board? And with regard to the old mowers?
They will go to auction.
Okay. Very good. All right, we have a motion by Mrs. Franks, supported by Mrs. Burton, for the approval of bid results for lawn equipment 2013 bond. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes, and President Johnson.
Yes, that motion carries. That takes us to item 7I, approval to purchase furniture for collaboration conference room. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Bonnefield.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the purchase of furniture from Interior Environments, Novi, Michigan, for a total cost of $29,722.96.
Support.
I have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Bradford. Mr. Francis.
Yes. This purchase is a general fund purchase, and it is for furniture that will furnish the central office collaboration conference room on this level of the building with flexible furniture. It's contract pricing used from Interior Environments, and it comes from the National Intergovernmental Purchasing Alliance, known also as the National IPA. The room that is being furnished is the area that our IT department used to be housed in. They have thus moved a couple floors up, and we have repurposed this area for another conference area in this building, and that's become a bit at a premium these days, some conference rooms. And this large space can be utilized not only by staff in this building, but also we had a presentation from the instructional coaches today. It's a perfect area for them to use. It's next to the mini lab that we have on this floor. It would be open to the buildings, etc. So this is the furniture purchase that we would like to place into that room to finish it off and get it open and ready for use for staff, not only in this building, but whomever across the district may need it.
Great, thanks, Mr. Francis. Questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Bradford, for the approval to purchase furniture for collaboration conference room. Would you take the roll, Mrs. Bonnefield?
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
President Johnson.
Yes, that motion carries. This takes us to item 7J, approval to adjust purchase order for flexible furniture at Churchill 2013 bond. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve an increase to purchase order number 86241 to Interior Environments in the amount of $4,329.60
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Burton. And Mr. Francis.
President Johnson, this increased amount is essentially due to an erroneous quote that we received, not maliciously, but accidentally. The total order for stools for Churchill High School that was brought to the board the month prior for approval, simply instead of 28, had listed 16 in the quote. Once it was realized, Interior Environments has requoted, this is the amount that is simply for those 12 stools. They have not added in any shipping or freight charges. We just need to increase the PO because the board has approved a specific amount, and now truly the total purchase is $4,329.60 higher than the board previously approved.
Thank you, Mr. Francis.
You're welcome.
Questions or comments? Mrs. Burton.
Is this still within the budget?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
That was my question.
That was your question?
And just to clarify, that original purchase and these extra dollars are from the flexible furniture budget from 2013 bond that the secondary schools were allocated.
All right, great. Any other questions? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Burton, for the approval to adjust the purchase order for flexible furniture at Churchill 2013 bond. Mrs. Benefield, would you take the roll?
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Benefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, that motion carries. That takes us to item 7K, approval to purchase flexible furniture for Riley 2013 bond. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mr. Centers.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the purchase of flexible furniture for Riley Upper Elementary School from Interior Environments for a total of $58,945.94.
Support.
We have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Jarvis. Mrs. Scott.
Thank you, President Johnson. As was discussed at the January 22nd Committee of the Whole, Riley's staff has worked with Interior Environments to design 2 areas at Riley that will provide alternate options for students to use while learning and working together collaboratively. The funds being utilized are from the 2013 bond allocated specifically for student furniture. Areas impacted by Riley's design include the collaboration station and the community room. This purchase utilizes the National Intergovernmental Purchasing Alliance discount program. And we also especially want to thank the community for supporting the bond in 2013, which has impacted all of our schools, staff, and students. And it's recommended that the board approve the flexible furniture purchase for Riley Upper Elementary.
Thank you, Mrs. Scott.
Thank you.
Questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, to approve the purchase of flexible furniture for Riley 2013 bond. Mrs. Bonneville, would you take the roll?
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Benefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, that motion carries. That takes us to item 8, our personnel matters. And item 8A is teachers for approval. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Frank.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the superintendent and offer employment for the 2018-19 school year to the teachers listed on the attached document.
Support.
We had a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Bradford. Is this going to be Mr. Archibald?
Yes, sir.
Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. These individuals were interviewed along with many other applicants for vacancies that existed in our instructional program. We believe that the teachers listed are the most qualified for the position indicated, and we recommend that they be approved for employment. These positions are within the 2018-2019 budget.
Thank you, Mr. Archibald. Questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Bradford for the approval of teachers. Mrs. Bonneville, would you take the roll?
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Benefield says yes, and President Johnson.
Yes, that motion carries. That takes us to item 8B, teachers for tenure. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Burton.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the superintendent and acknowledge that tenure status be granted to the following teachers effective on the respective date. George Anagnostopoulos, January 27th, 2019. Nicole Young, January 27th, 2019.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mr. Centers. And Mr. Archibald again.
Yes, thank you again. The teachers named have successfully met the requirements for a probationary teacher to be granted tenure, including years of service and job performance as indicated through their annual evaluation process. We're asking that the Board of Education acknowledge that these individuals have in fact achieved tenure status.
Thank you, Mr. Archibald. Questions or comments from the board?
Congratulations.
Yep, congratulations indeed. We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mr. Centers, to grant tenure status to teachers. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, that motion carries. That takes us to item 8C, leave of absence. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Bradford.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the superintendent and approve the request for a leave of absence as listed below. Sharice Howell, 2019-2020 school year.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mrs. Burton. Mr. Archibald again.
Thank you again. This request for a leave is in accordance with the LEA collective bargaining agreement, and as such, we're requesting that the leave be approved as requested for the 2019-2020 school year.
Thank you, Mr. Archibald. Any questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mrs. Burton, to approve a leave of absence. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, motion carries. That takes us to item 8D, removal from recall list. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Bonnefield.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District remove the following teacher from any form of a recall list, thereby eliminating her from any rights to future employment. Catherine Salvatore.
Support.
Stereo.
Yeah.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Burton. Mr. Archibald.
Yes, thank you. In accordance with the LEA collective bargaining agreement, the recall rights for the teacher listed have expired. Just for your information, that length of time is the length of the individual's service or up to a period of 5 years. And in this instance, that time has passed.
Thank you, Mr. Archibald. Any questions or comments from the board? Seeing none. Mr. Archibald, do we have any teachers left on the recall list?
I'm channeling.
Little birdie?
We will confirm that. We don't believe there are any K-12 teachers currently, but we'll verify that and get back to you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Burton, to remove teacher from recall list. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
President Johnson.
Yes, the motion carries. That takes us to item 8E, resolutions of appreciation for employees who are retiring. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District adopt the attached resolutions of appreciation for the services rendered by Kathy Marcosi and Sean Rogers.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Frank. Again, Mr. Archibald.
Yes, again, tonight we bring before you the names of these two employees, of which we are all very familiar, who will be retiring. These individuals retire with a combined 57.1 years of experience with Livonia Public Schools. And on behalf of the district, I would like to thank both of them for their years of dedicated service to our students, to our staff, and to the district as a whole, and ask that the board adopt the attached resolution of appreciation in their honor.
Thank you, Mr. Archibald. Questions or comments from the board?
Congratulations.
Yes, and thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Miss.
It's always tough to lose somebody with that much experience, but we wish them the best in the next phase of their life. We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Frank, to adopt the resolutions of appreciations for employees who are retiring. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, the motion carries. We'll move on to item 9, hearing from board members, and as customary, we have a number of policy issues tonight, and we have 3 for second readings, and the first one is item A, second reading of board policy JH, student clubs and activities, and this includes removal of board policy JHCA, student clubs. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Burton.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee and adopt board policy language per the attached document for Board Policy JH, student clubs and activities, and remove Board Policy JHCA, student clubs.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Bradford. And Mr. Willenborg is going to help us with this.
Yes, thank you, President Johnson. For the last 2 months, we have reviewed the merging of these 2 policies, a separate policy on student clubs, a separate policy on student activities. We noted there's very similar verbiage in the 2 policies. There's very similar rules, especially with the rules associated to having to be approved by school administration to provide equal access to all students. We decided that we should merge these 2 policies, and after that review, I think we're ready to recommend the approval of the new and improved single policy, JH, student clubs and activities.
Thank you, Mr. Willenborg. Are there any questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Bradford, to adopt board policy JH, student clubs and activities. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes. Motion carries.
Thank you.
That brings us to item 9B, second reading of board policy GAMA, alcohol and drug abuse. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Frank.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee and adopt policy language per the attached document, Board Policy GAMA, alcohol and drug abuse.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mr. Centers. Mr. Archibald is going to help us with this one.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Johnson. The substantive change in this policy is to incorporate marijuana and marijuana use to be treated similarly to how we currently treat alcohol and alcohol use by employees while serving in their capacity as employees. And the other changes were simple clarifications or editorial changes to reflect the current practices, for example, with respect to our employee assistance program and alike. But as you recall from many discussions, we've been reviewing and discussing and consulting on this policy since October.
Thank you, Mr. Archibald. Questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, Mr. Archibald, you guys put in a whole lot of work on this particular policy. It was not easy to modify this one and come up with the language, and the board really appreciates all the work that you put in on this one.
Very well.
All right, we have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mr. Centers, to adopt board policy GAMA, alcohol and drug abuse. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes, that motion carries. That takes us to item 9C, second reading and removal of board policy. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson?
Mrs. Bonnefield.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee to remove Board Policy JGFE, student bicycle use.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Burton. And Mrs. Scott.
Thank you, President Johnson. As already been stated, this is the second reading of Board Policy JGFE on bicycle use. It has been discussed at past board meetings with the recommendation that this policy be removed from the board policy. The student handbooks contain procedures created specific to the schools where necessary and communicated to the parents. And we thank the board for their consideration.
Thank you, Mrs. Scott. Questions, comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Burton, for the second reading and adoption of board and removal of board policy JGFE, student bicycle use. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll?
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
President Johnson?
Yes, that motion carries. That takes us to item 9D, and this is a first reading of Board Policy DFKA, crowdsourced fundraising. And I think Dr. Terrill is going to help us with this one.
Correct. I will take this on behalf of Allison Smith. Good evening.
Good evening.
Policy DFKA was originally approved by the Board of Education on November 26, 2018. However, we wanted to include language acknowledging authorized PTA, PTSA, and booster clubs and their purchasing procedures. Additionally, monies or items secured through these agents would be the property of the district or the agency. The policy committee would recommend that this policy be placed on the agenda at the next regular meeting for a second reading and potential approval.
Thank you, Dr. Terrill.
You're welcome.
Questions, comments, input from the board? Mrs. Burton.
Would just like to thank the members of our PTSA, specifically community, and some of our booster clubs, but it was mostly the PTSA that brought to our attention very shortly after we passed this policy in November that from their perspective, there were a couple of items that were problematic. They wanted very much to be in compliance with policy, but the way we had it written, they would have been, by their very activity, has been out of compliance. And it was by their request that we took another look at it from their perspective. So I'd just like to thank the folks who very quickly, very respectfully brought it to our attention so that we can make the necessary corrections and make sure that we're all playing the game appropriately.
Absolutely, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Everyone in agreement, then we'll put this on for a second reading?
Yes.
Next regular meeting. Thank you. It takes us to item 9E, approval for board members to attend MASB, MASA Winter Institute 2019. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mr. Centers.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve that up to 3 board trustees attend the MASB, MASA Winter Institute 2019 conference on February 8 in Detroit, Michigan for a cost of $199 per person.
Support.
We have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Jarvis. Mrs. Oquist, you'll be helping us?
I will. This Friday, there's an opportunity to have members of boards of education via MASB, as well as local superintendents via MASA, to attend a joint conference as part of the Winter Institute. It's being held in Detroit, and I believe we have at least one trustee who will be attending, along with myself, for that opportunity on February 8th.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist. Any questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, for the approval of board members to attend MASB, MASA Winter Institute 2019. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll?
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes. Motion carries. Enjoy and bring us back some good information. That takes us to item 9F, Superintendent Evaluation. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Frank.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the evaluation of Superintendent Andrea Oquist completed by using the MASB evaluation tool for which she received a highly effective rating.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, for superintendent evaluation. Are there any questions or comments? Mr. Centers?
First, I want to congratulate Mrs. Oquist. She's certainly a top performer as far as superintendents in the area, if not the state. I could probably speak for everyone that we are thrilled with the job that she does, the way she presents herself in the community, her commitment to student growth and achievement, and just, really putting emphasis on the climate and culture of our district. I do want to say that this is a little bit of a tweaked formula for us, though, and it'll be taking place for all our staff this year, that student growth and achievement takes a 40% chunk of the evaluation. This is obviously something that she's worked on a lot, but in research is not shown to be an effective use to guide, evaluate our staff, or also to be instructive in making them better professionals. We could also talk about the methodology that people are assessed on, but that would be a whole other conversation. But so this is something new to all of our staff, including Mrs. Oquist. Obviously, everyone works very hard, and I would like to congratulate her because this is becoming, very, very high stakes, and we want to, make sure that our staff are prepared that this is something that is coming down the pike and is now kind of our reality. But thank you, Mrs. Oquist, for working so hard and for everything you've done for our district.
Thank you, Mr. Centers. Other questions or comments? Mrs. Frank.
I also wanted to just thank Mrs. Oquist and her entire team for all the work that she does on behalf of our students and our staff and our community. I think you do a phenomenal job, and we thank you for all that you do. One of the things I think is so important, just like we talked about with our coaches, no matter how great you are, there's room for improvement. And I think when we had your evaluation, it was over 3 hours. It was a phenomenal time to talk about your vision for the district, and I think your vision is not to stop where we are, is to raise the bar and to continue to improve and to build capacity within our district, and I think that is a phenomenal vision to continuously want to improve and to grow. So thank you for that, and thank you to your staff.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Mrs. Bonnefield.
I just want to point out that each board member has been trained on this evaluation. It's an MASB evaluation. It's a lengthy and pretty tough rubric that we need to cover on it. So this is not something that the board takes lightly, nor do we do it in an uninformed process. So I want to thank my fellow board members for the time and the effort. And like Mrs. Frank said, it was a grueling 3 hours. But I laugh, but it's a very serious evaluation, and we take it with great responsibility. The superintendent is the board's one and only employee, and it's our job to make sure that the district runs. We have a quality district, and I think Mrs. Oquist, Superintendent Oquist, is just deserves all the kudos that she gets. She leads our district with dignity and pride.
Thank you, Mrs. Bonnefield. Mrs. Bradford.
I echo all the sentiments of my fellow board members, and I just want to thank Mrs. Oquist for all her hard work. She's highly visible in the district, and she's highly approachable at all times, and we are very fortunate to have such a wonderful member to work with, and every day come to work and see Mrs. Oquist. So thank you so much for all you do for the district on behalf of all the students and our staff and community. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Bradford. Other questions or comments? Mrs. Burton.
The board does an official evaluation, but whenever we are out in the public, when we're in our buildings, when we're at the grocery store, wherever we happen to be, it probably one time out of every 3, someone stops me to commend your role and your work as our superintendent. Your personality, your work ethic, and your deep knowledge of our school district and of education in our district and in the state of Michigan is evident throughout our community. And it feels fabulous as board members. We know what we have in you, but it's terrific when you go out into our community and so many people recognize that also. It's just terrific. I hope you work for a really, really long time.
Here in Livonia.
Here in Livonia Public Schools as the superintendent specifically.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Other questions or comments? Mrs. Jarvis.
Yeah, I'll take a turn. We had a unique opportunity to attend a workshop with school board trustees from across Michigan recently, and it's always remarkable to go there and have them tell us what a wonderful superintendent we have. So obviously we concur, and we are so appreciative of what you do every single day to make this a wonderful school district. Whether you're a student, a parent, a staff member, a cabinet member, every single person feels like you know them personally, you respect them, and that regard is so evident in what you do. And I think it goes a long way to making our district just a fabulous place to belong to.
Thank you, Mrs. Jarvis. Well, there isn't a whole lot more to say. But I spend a lot of time with Andrea in our meetings, and I think the one thing that really strikes me is not only that she takes the time to know everybody. I mean, she goes into school, she knows the secretary, she knows their children, she knows everything. But she is the last one to take any credit. She's always transferring that to her staff, to cabinet. That's what I think is one of the best attributes that you have. And we do have an outstanding cabinet. So thank you all. Okay, we have a motion by Mrs. Franks, supported by Mrs. Jarvis for the superintendent's evaluation. Mrs. Bonnefield.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Oh, yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes emphatically, and President Johnson.
Yes, motion carries. Thank you, Mrs. Oquist, for everything you do.
Thank you so much. I'm honored and humbled to serve as the superintendent of truly this amazing district, representing a truly dedicated and committed staff who work on behalf of students tirelessly. And I certainly don't take your trust and confidence for granted. And I want to continue to, as Mrs. Frank said, continue to exact our vision for the future on behalf of everyone that we serve. And I am so grateful for your ongoing partnership and support. Thank you.
That will move us to item 9G, hearing from board members, and is customary. At this point, I will open the floor to anyone who would like to make comments. Mrs. Bonnefield.
I just want to say I wrote down a lot of yes votes today. We had a lot of motions that we went through. And I want to say the reason that these go so smoothly is that, one, as we've talked about earlier, we meet almost every Monday to make sure these things are all in order. Our cabinet and our superintendent works tirelessly to bring us the information. They know and understand the Board of Education, and a lot of times they know what we're going to ask, and they're ready and prepared. If we do have questions, they go back and answer those questions fully and promptly. And most of the stuff that comes to these voting meetings, and President Johnson notes this at the beginning of each voting meeting, if they're not ready to come to the table for a vote, they don't come to the table for a vote in most cases. Well, in all cases. Occasionally, there will be something where there will be a difference of opinion, but these things have just been gone through up and down, and so when they come to the board table, we are confident and ready to make that decision and know that we've put the time and effort into making the right choice for our district.
Thank you, Mrs. Bonnefield. Other questions, comments? Mrs. Jarvis?
Thank you. I would just like to express gratitude to the community at Nicci for inviting myself and President Johnson to their Moshitsuki Festival, celebrating the new year. We had a ball. It was just amazing, pounding the mochi rice and meeting with so many parents and staff members there. It was a tremendous celebration, and I just want to say domo arigato.
Thank you, Mrs. Jarvis. Anyone else? Mrs. Burton?
I usually speak on behalf of myself. In this case, I'm going to speak on behalf of the board because I'm absolutely confident that my peers agree with me on this. I would like to express heartfelt thanks to so many of our staff members who got us through our winter week. We'll just leave it at that. While most of us were home, snuggled in and trying to enjoy a few days off, we had staff who were out plowing snow, working in ridiculous cold. We had administrative folks who were out in the middle of the night, 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning, assessing streets, fielding phone calls, literally, and emails throughout the night from community members, staff, students, well, not so much staff, students, parents, emailing at like 3 o'clock in the morning. So just to find out what's going on, it was unprecedented conditions, and our staff really came through. Our maintenance staff, our transportation folks were amazing. Even last Friday, when many districts didn't think they could get back online again, we had all but one of our buses starting up, and that's because our transportation staff was in throughout the night working on getting buses going because diesel doesn't like it when it's that cold. There are just hundreds of employees in this district who, while we were enjoying some time off, they were working very hard to make sure we could come back on again. And we just really express our sincere thanks for all of your work.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton.
That was a good.
Yes, thank you for saying that.
Anything else? Seeing none, then we're going to move on to item 9H, recess to closed session to consider written legal opinion from counsel. And I just want to let everyone know that once we adjourn, we will not be coming back on camera after that. So just need to make that announcement. So may I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Burton?
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District recess to closed session for the purpose of consideration of written legal opinion from counsel regarding a personnel matter.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Bradford. Are there any questions or comments? Seeing none, Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Burton?
Yes. Sorry.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes, that motion carries, and we are now going into closed session. Thank you.
To the conference room, guys?
Yep.